All right, so welcome back, everyone. And we are going to continue with emotion. I just spoke briefly about patient SM who has no fear. I have a quick little figure after showing pictures of her lack of amygdala on both sides of the brain. Something interesting is that it's actually very difficult for her to even describe fear. So when asked to draw a fearful expression, she actually can't imagine it. So she can imagine happiness, sadness, surprise, disgust, anger, those very basic emotions that we study within psychology. But when asked to draw fear, she drew a baby. And she remembered that frightened people are often depicted with their hair on end, her words. And so she drew a baby with its hair sticking up. So something kind of interested. Personally, also kind of afraid of babies, so I understand that. So moving on to our next slide about the strange brain of the world's greatest solo climber. This is put in here so that you can go and check out this article. You can read it online if you are interested. But the rock climber Alex Honnold, he has a TED Talk. He has really fascinating articles and interviews out there. He has climbed one of the really large peaks in Yosemite. He's the fastest and like the first free climber to climb up it. And it's one of those peaks that like you hear on the news, like 3 or 4 people die climbing it every year. And so there have been neuroimaging studies to see what it is that makes him possibly any different from someone else. And if we look a little bit forward, we see that his prefrontal cortex works just fine. So he's not having any type of prefrontal cortex damage that would cause him to be irrational in his decision to do these, death-defying climbs. But there's the thought that possibly his amygdala isn't firing and isn't acting as much as someone else's would in this situation. So he's maybe not having as much of a reaction to climbing up this rock face as someone else would. But why that's the case, that's more tricky. Is it due to practice? Was he born this way and then chose to become a rock climber? We don't know. And it's really hard to find out these type of answers without grabbing a bunch of 2-year-olds and placing them into different lifestyles, which isn't really ethical. But I highly recommend you to check out his TED Talks about his experience with just a general absence of fear while doing rock climbing. So next on our slide was a Thinkpairshare, which sadly, you guys are all alone. But I have placed up our questions from the Thinkpairshare in our discussion board, and I would love if you guys were able to participate in the discussion board. Granted, the Thinkpairshare is just for you to do on your own, but if you have questions, comments, thoughts, weird ideas you thought of while interacting with this, emotions you've been feeling during this crazy time, share it with us. The discussion board can be found under the Tools section on Blackboard, and there is an entire forum there for Chapter 7 on emotion. You can post whatever is pertinent to you on this, and hopefully we have some interaction among students. I'll check in daily. There's also a part of the discussion board for you to post pictures of your pets. And if you don't have pets, your dream pets. And if you don't like pets, post something else. All right. So let's move on to fear as a primal emotion. As I mentioned, we need fear. Fear is currently what is keeping us hopefully a little bit safer right now as a human population as we isolate ourselves at home. Fear of both the unknown and of what we do know by looking at other countries around the world, such as China's track, and then Italy, and then Spain, and knowing the trajectories and having fear of the same outcomes is what motivates us to avoid danger. So this is so pertinent to us right now. Fear is the most studied emotion in psychology. It's very easy to study and to compare to different other affects. And, it's both connected within the brain and emotions, but we can also measure it within the limbic system. And that is what makes it even easier. It's hard to really measure happiness. You can measure if somebody smiles, but somebody can be blank-faced and still be completely enjoying their time. However, for fear, you can have a skin response on the palm. Almost immediately, you will have a sweat response. You get a heightened heartbeat. You start noticing blood pressure changes, digestive changes. All of these are almost instant. And it helps us as psychologists to be able to have these physiological measures, because sometimes our participants don't even know that they're scared, but their body does. So let's move to our next slide. Fear also activates two systems in the body, fight or flight, within the sympathetic nervous system. Of course, I mentioned way back long ago that there are some other responses people have, such as freezing or trying to negotiate. But fight or flight is definitely the most studied. Something else that we see within the human system is the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. We're just going to call it the HPA axis. So this involves hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal cortex. And this is a little bit more slow than our autonomic nervous system that we discussed way back when. So remember that our autonomic nervous system is what is affecting a lot of things like our heart rate and blood pressure during those times of fear or emotion in general. And so we see that fear affects these different systems. So specifically, when we look at the HPA axis in the next slide, we see both, the hypothalamus becoming activated. We see the adrenocorticotropic hormone, so ACTH, is released by the pituitary gland. The adrenal cortex is going to have cortisol, which we normally have cortisol at all times of the day, and it peaks during the morning and kind of ebbs off, and it has a usual track. But stress and fear cause it to deviate from its normal kind of rise and fall that it should do during the day, which is why we often like to measure cortisol levels during times of stress and anxiety. And then one of the other things we see is the metabolic levels, like blood glucose levels and alertness increase, because if something fearful is happening, you've got to suddenly be awake, you've got to be active, you've got to get your stuff together, pack your bag, get ready to run, fight, do something, because your life might depend on it. So you see all of these things that activate, which is why fear is often just such a physically draining thing, because your body is interacting just as much as your mind. So moving to the next slide, healthy primal fear reactions can sometimes snowball into maladaptive disorders. This is something that we're probably going to see a lot more of in the coming weeks to months as things kind of get a little bit more out of control in society around us. So one example of this is that we learn through our emotions, but sometimes this leads to irrational fears like phobias. This leads to people who become claustrophobic or afraid of heights, or people who become terrified of specific social situations or animals. We also see dysfunctions that are brought on by our own working memory systems. Remember, working memory is manipulating thoughts, and it's using that interpreter. So we're constantly thinking about things, imagining scenarios too much. Oh my gosh, we're thinking about the same type of scenarios and they're becoming more and more negative, and we're thinking about how it could get worse and worse and worse. And next thing you know, that anxiety has started to become out of control as you think about the future, or that depressive rumination about thinking of the past. So when we look at anxiety disorders especially, they really kind of reflect that breakdown in our ability to regulate our emotions, especially when we have really great working memory systems as human beings. So fear in and of itself can manifest into these generalized anxiety disorders. And it's tough, it's difficult, but this is why we have psychiatrists and therapists and amazing psychologists to also help us through and to recognize these patterns when they become unhealthy and to help treat them. So that is actually going to be the end of our emotion lecture. I have a discussion board question for you if you are interested in putting out your thoughts. It asks, why might cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness training be effective for those who suffer from generalized anxiety disorder, depression, PTSD, etc.? You'll find that in our discussion board under Chapter 7. I will also post a TED Talk, which you will see as our last slide, about our emotions and how you aren't at the mercy of your emotions. Your brain creates them, which at a certain extent is true. And at another extent, times are crazy, and we're all just trying the best that we can. And I wish you all the best of luck. I will be filming our Chapter 8 mini lectures for next week and get them posted early in the week. And I will see you all later. Bye.